The Doña Paz disaster. The deadly peacetime maritime tragedy in history. Imagine boarding a ferry just days before Christmas. You are excited to see your family. Children are laughing. Parents are carrying gifts. Students are heading home for the holidays. The sea is calm. The night seems ordinary. But within a few terrifying minutes, thousands of people would be trapped in a floating inferno. No distress signal. No chance of escape. And by sunrise, more than 4,000 people would be dead. The disaster was so devastating that it became the deadliest peacetime maritime tragedy in history. Yet outside the Philippines, many people have never heard of it. This is the horrifying story of the 1005 Doña Paz. Chapter 1. The ferry known as the Asia's Titanic. The Doña Paz was a passenger ferry operating in the Philippines. Originally built in Japan in 1963, the vessel was later sold and renamed several times before becoming part of the fleet of Sulpicio Lines, one of the country's largest shipping companies. By the 1980s, ferries like the Doña Paz were essential. The Philippines is made up of more than 7,000 islands, and millions of people relied on ships to travel between them. Air travel was expensive. For many families, ferries were the only practical option. The Doña Paz regularly carried passengers between major islands, transporting workers, students, families, and tourists. Officially, the ferry was licensed to carry about 1,500 passengers. But overcrowding was common. During holiday seasons, ferries often carried far more people than regulations allowed. And December 1987 was one of the busiest travel periods of the year. Nobody knew that the stage was already being set for catastrophe. Chapter 2. December 20, 1987. On the 20th December, the Doña Paz departed from Tacloban City and began its journey toward Manila. The atmosphere on board was festive. Christmas was only a few days away. Passengers filled nearly every available space. Families shared meals. Children played in the hallways. Many passengers slept wherever they could find room. According to later investigations, the actual number of people on board may have been staggering. Official records listed around 1,500 passengers, but survivor accounts suggested thousands more had boarded without being properly recorded. Some estimates placed the total number of people on board at over 4,000. If true, the ferry was carrying nearly 3 times its legal capacity. Meanwhile, another vessel was navigating the same waters, an oil tanker named the Vector. Unlike the crowded ferry, the Vector carried a deadly cargo, more than 1 million liters of gasoline and petroleum products. The two ships were heading toward each other in the darkness, and neither crew appeared to realize the danger. Chapter 3. A deadly collision. At approximately 10:30 p.m., disaster struck. Near the Tablas Strait, the Doña Paz collided with the oil tanker Vector. Witnesses later described a tremendous impact. Passengers were thrown from their seats. Many initially thought they had hit rocks, but the real horror came seconds later. A collision ruptured the tanker's cargo tanks. Thousands of gallons of fuel spilled into the sea, and then ignited. A massive explosion erupted across the water. Within moments, flames engulfed both vessels. The ocean itself appeared to be on fire. Passengers suddenly found themselves trapped inside a burning ship. The darkness of the night was replaced by a wall of flames. Screams echoed across the decks. Panic spread instantly. People rushed toward exits. Many found them blocked. Others discovered there were not enough life jackets available. The situation deteriorated almost immediately. For thousands of people on board, there would be no escape. Chapter 4. Hell on the Water. Survivor testimonies paint a horrifying picture. Many passengers were asleep when the collision occurred. They woke to explosions, fire, and chaos. Some ran to the decks, only to find flames surrounding them. Others became trapped inside cabins and corridors. The heat was unbearable. As the fire spread, families became separated. Parents lost sight of their children. Brothers and sisters disappeared into the crowds. Desperate passengers began jumping into the sea, but even the water offered little protection. Burning fuel had spread across the surface. People found themselves swimming through flames. Some suffered severe burns. Others inhaled toxic smoke. Many drowned while trying to escape. One survivor later recalled seeing the ocean glowing orange. Bodies floated among patches of burning fuel. The scene resembled something from a nightmare. And still, the disaster continued. Within only a short period of time, both vessels were consumed by fire. The Doña Paz began sinking. The Vector was also doomed. Thousands of people were left struggling in the dark sea. Few would survive. Before we continue, if you are fascinated by true disasters, maritime mysteries, and real-life tragedies that changed history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We explore some of the most shocking events ever recorded. Trust me, this story becomes even more unbelievable as we uncover what investigators discovered afterward. Now let us continue. Chapter 5. No Distress Signal. One of the most shocking aspects of the tragedy was what did not happen. No effective distress signal was sent. No immediate rescue request reached nearby authorities. As thousands fought for their lives, help was not on the way. The burning ships vanished into the darkness. For hours, survivors drifted in the sea. Some clung to wreckage. Others floated using pieces of debris. Many watched family members disappear into the night. The water around them was filled with cries for help. Then one by one, the voices began to fade. By dawn, only a tiny fraction of those on board remained alive. The scale of the disaster was still unknown, and the worst revelations were yet to come. Chapter 6. The Rescue. Several hours after the collision, rescue operations finally began. Nearby vessels encountered survivors floating in the water. What they found was shocking. Many survivors were severely burned. Others were suffering from dehydration, shock, and exhaustion. Some had spent hours surrounded by fire and darkness. As rescue teams gathered information, they quickly realized something horrifying. The number of survivors was incredibly small. Out of thousands believed to be on board, only a few dozen had lived through the disaster. Reports eventually confirmed that just 24 passengers from the Doña Paz survived. Only 2 crew members made it out alive. From the Vector, only a handful survived. The death toll climbed rapidly. As investigators soon faced a major problem. Nobody knew exactly how many people had been on board. Chapter 7. The Shocking Death Toll. Determining the number of victims proved extremely difficult. Passenger manifests were incomplete. Many travelers had purchased tickets informally. Others may have boarded without being recorded. As authorities pieced together the evidence, estimates became increasingly grim. The final official death toll reached approximately 4,386 people. That number surpassed many of the world's most famous maritime disasters. More people died aboard the Doña Paz than on the Titanic. In fact, excluding wartime sinkings, it remains the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in history. Yet despite its staggering scale, the tragedy never received the same international attention as the Titanic. For many families in the Philippines, however, the pain never faded. Entire households disappeared. Some villages lost dozens of residents. Many bodies were never recovered. For countless families, there would be no funeral, no grave. Only unanswered grief. Chapter 8. What went wrong? Investigators soon began examining how such a catastrophe could happen. Their findings revealed a series of alarming failures. Reports suggested the Vector may not have been properly licensed to operate. Questions emerged about whether it had qualified personnel on board. Some accounts claim the vessel lacked a fully certified master. Investigators also looked at conditions aboard the Doña Paz. Survivors reported inadequate safety procedures. There were allegations that life jackets were difficult to access. Some passengers claimed no safety briefing had been provided. Overcrowding became another major focus. If estimates were correct, thousands of additional passengers were on board beyond the vessel's legal capacity. The collision itself also raised serious concerns. How could two ships collide on a relatively open stretch of water? Investigations pointed toward navigational failures and human error. Rather than a single mistake, the disaster appeared to result from multiple breakdowns occurring simultaneously. Each failure compounded the next, and together, they created one of the deadliest transportation disasters in modern history. Chapter 9. The Legacy of the Doña Paz. The tragedy shocked the Philippines. Public outrage followed. Questions were raised about maritime safety standards. Authorities promised reforms. Shipping regulations received increased scrutiny. Passenger documentation procedures were reviewed. Safety requirements became a larger focus within the maritime industry. Yet the legacy of the Doña Paz extends beyond regulations. The disaster became a symbol of how quickly ordinary life can enter into catastrophe. Thousands of people boarded that ferry expecting a routine journey home for Christmas. Most never arrived. Their final moments were spent facing a nightmare few could imagine. Today, decades later, the story continues to serve as a warning. Safety procedures matter. Maintenance matters. Training matters. Because when they fail, the consequences can be measured in thousands of lives. Conclusion. The story of the MV Doña Paz is more than a maritime disaster. It is a human tragedy on an almost unimaginable scale. More than 4,000 people vanished in a single night. Families were destroyed. Communities were forever changed. And one ordinary ferry trip became one of the deadliest transportation disasters the world has ever seen. Even now, nearly 4 decades later, the images remain haunting. A crowded ferry, a dark sea, a sudden collision, and an ocean consumed by fire. For the survivors, those memories never disappeared, and for the victims, the waters of the Tapless Strait became their final resting place. If you found this story informative, please give this video a like and subscribe for more true disaster stories, historical mysteries, and unbelievable real-life events. And let me know in the comments. Which disaster should we cover next? The sea holds many secrets. Some of them are more terrifying than fiction. Thanks for watching.